Shalom friends, and welcome to the second lesson in Yackov. We're going to continue from a verse that we brought yesterday from Psalms. That King David said that at midnight I arise to give thanks to Hashem, to give thanks to God. King David told us his schedule, that at midnight every day he wakes up, he gets up, he rises, and he gives thanks to Hashem. He says he involves himself in saying psalms and praises to God. So, King David said, at midnight I arise. Exactly at midnight. Meaning, King David had a certain, right now the Gemara thinks that King David had a certain intuition, like a godly intuition, that he knew how to identify. He had intuition to identify the exact moment of midnight. And therefore the Gemara is bothered by this. The Gemara says, how can it be that King David knew how to identify the exact time? He had this intuition to identify the exact time of midnight, if even Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet, didn't have this intuition. And how do we know that Moshe didn't have this intuition? Because in the story in the Torah regarding the plague of the firstborn, when Hashem notified Moshe Rabbeinu that at midnight, exactly at midnight, he will go out in the midst of Egypt. So when Moshe Rabbeinu related this to the Egyptians, he didn't tell them like Hashem told them, at midnight, exactly at midnight, Hashem will go out in your midst. But he told them, at about midnight. So said Hashem, at about midnight, around midnight, I will go out in the midst of Egypt. So we see that Moshe Rabbeinu, and why did Moshe Rabbeinu do this? Why did he say it around midnight? Because he didn't have the intuition to identify the exact moment. And therefore, although Hashem told him at midnight, so he could have just related what Hashem said, but he didn't want to put himself in a position that he would be challenged and by the astrologists of the Pharaoh, and he wouldn't have what to answer them because he doesn't know when exactly the time is. So I hope you followed what I just said from the story of the plague of the firstborn. But the point is that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have this intuition to identify the exact moment of midnight. And therefore, Moshe is known as the greatest prophet. And therefore, the Gemara says, if Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet, didn't have a way to identify the midnight, how can it be that King David had a way to had this intuition to identify the exact moment of midnight? So the Gemara explains, so we're going to give on this two answers. We're going to give it two answers. Actually, three answers. The first answer is that King David did not have this intuition to know on his own when midnight would be. Rather, King David had an artificial way to know when it was midnight. He had a sign to tell him exactly when it was midnight. And this is as Rav Chana Bar, the son of Chama, Rav Chama, the son of Bizna, said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida that King David had a harp hung over his bed. The famous harp of King David hung over his bed. And at midnight, the northern wind always would come and blow Because like the Gemara says somewhere else, that the northern wind blows during the second 6 hours of the night, beginning at midnight. So beginning at midnight, the northern wind blows. And therefore David put a harp over his bed, and he positioned it with the holes facing the north. And that way, when the north wind blew, at midnight it would blow on the harp, and it would vibrate its strings, it would play. And it would play by itself. And therefore, immediately when he heard the harp play, so he would get up and he would study Torah until dawn. So that's the first answer. That you're right. It cannot be that Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet, didn't have this godly intuition to know exactly when is midnight, but King David did have it. You're right, King David didn't either have it. But he had the harp over his bed, and that's what he used. He had this trick, and that's what he used to know exactly when it was midnight. That's the first answer. The first way to resolve this. The second way to resolve it is that the truth is now, how do we know? The Gemara brings, how do we know that King David had this harp? Because there's also actually a verse in Psalms that King David says, "Awake, O my soul, awake, O lyre and harp, I shall awake in the dawn." David is telling himself that unlike other kings, that they take honor by sleeping, you should wake up before dawn through the sound of the harp at midnight. Okay, this is the source for this. So that's the first answer. Second answer is that the truth is Moshe Rabbeinu did know that exact moment. And King David also knew the exact moment of midnight. They had this intuition, they had this godly intuition to know exactly the exact moment, to identify the exact moment of midnight. But if so first of all, let's go to King David. So why did King David need to have the harp right over his bed? Why did he need to have the harp over his bed? So the Gemara says King David needed that not to help him identify when midnight is, rather to wake him up from his sleep. According to what we learned yesterday, that he would be dozing off until midnight, so therefore he needed the harp to tell him, okay, it comes midnight, you better strengthen yourself and get up. And what about Moshe Rabbeinu? If Moshe Rabbeinu knew the exact time, so why did he need to say? Why did he need to tell the astrologers, the Egyptians, that at about midnight? Earlier we said that the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't just relay to them the exact message of God that at midnight, because he didn't want to be put in a position, because we thought that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have this intuition, and therefore he didn't know how to identify the exact time of midnight. And therefore, even if he would relate the exact message of God, maybe he would be put in a position to prove it, and he wouldn't be able to do it. So he didn't want to do that. So he said it about midnight. But if Moshe Rabbeinu knew, so why did he have to say it about midnight? Just say it midnight, and if you would be challenged, then you would be able to prove yourself because he knows how to identify the exact moment. The answer is because Moshe was scared that perhaps the astrologers of Pari, they would be making the mistake. They would calculate the wrong moment of midnight. And therefore, not because he wouldn't be able to prove it, but because perhaps they would also try to prove that they know their moment, but they would be mistaken, and then they would say, "Oh, Moshe Rabbeinu, you're a liar. You're a liar." And therefore Moshe said that it's better. He was very careful, like another sage taught. It says that you should teach your tongue to say, "I do not know." It's better to say, "I don't know," because maybe you will misspeak and you will become trapped in a falsehood. So Moshe Rabbeinu also was very careful regarding this, and therefore he said, you know what, let me not say anything, let me say at around midnight, that way they cannot as if catch me, because they made the mistake and call me a liar. It's better to claim ignorance. They say something that might be considered false and lead to a loss of trust. So that's the second answer. The first answer was, the Gemara says that you're right. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know, King David didn't either know. The second answer is no. Moshe Rabbeinu did know, and so did King David. They both had this godly intuition. But why did King David need the harp? That's to get him up, to tell him that what time it was midnight, so he would gird himself up and be fully awake. And Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say exactly when was. He didn't say midnight. He said about midnight. So because maybe the astrologers would make the mistake and they would call him a liar, even though of course he knew the exact time. That's the second answer. The third answer is that when Moshe Rabbeinu said, we're translating the Hebrew word kachatzois, which kachatzois means at about midnight. But Rav Ashi says no, don't translate it that way. Don't translate it kachatzois to mean at about midnight. You could translate it to mean like midnight. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking to the Jewish people 24 hours before the plague, and he was telling the Jewish people, listen, tomorrow night, like this time now of midnight, just like right now it's midnight, like tonight's midnight, the same time as tonight, tomorrow night Hashem will go out in the midst of Egypt. In other words, just like it is midnight now, so too when it will be midnight tomorrow night, the plague will come. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu said. And therefore, so according to this answer, I think that, in other words, the Gemara is saying is that of course Moshe Rabbeinu had this intuition. And therefore, and King David also had this intuition, because they are both godly people, and they had this intuition to identify the exact time of midnight. But Moshe, he didn't say at around chatzos, he said like chatzos, and therefore you didn't translate it right, and therefore you had this difficulty. Okay, so basically we resolved the difficulty. Anyways. Good.